Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Mian Oh, Director of the Atlantic Council's Asia Security Initiative, housed within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this morning's panel discussion on deepening economic partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. Today's event is part of Asia Security Initiative long-running cross-strait seminar series that we're proud to be hosting in partnership with the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office. Today's discussion provides a critical opportunity for leading experts in Washington, D.C. to come together to discuss how the United States, its allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific can work together with Taiwan to enhance in-depth economic relations in the midst of rising tensions between Taipei and Beijing. Taipei has come under increased economic, military, and diplomatic pressures from Beijing in recent months, and Taiwan represents a choke point in global supply chains caused by the pandemic and chip shortage worldwide, which is giving new urgency to national security strategies across the region. Taiwan has also recently applied to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, a significant development given Taipei's economic presence as Asia's seventh largest economy and a key trade partner of the United States and its partners in the region. As such, the United States and its allies and partners have become increasingly aware that ensuring Taiwan's economic resilience in the face of increased pressure from Beijing is integral to maintaining the entire region's economic security. In June 2021, as you know, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken publicly stated that Biden administration's plan to launch previously suspended trade and investment talks with Taiwan, while Japan has also openly advocated for Taiwan's inclusion in regional trade frameworks such as RCEP and CPTPP. For this reason, today's discussion comes at an especially important time as we in the Asia Security Initiative continue our effort to develop concrete and actionable policy recommendations for the coordinated response to the rise of China with U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. As a reminder, today's event is open to the public and on the record. Our audience members joining through Zoom can submit their questions at any time using the Q&A function. And there may be time towards the end of the session for me to raise any relevant questions to our panelists. And we're very fortunate today to be joined by a fantastic panel with deep expertise on this issue set. And I'm eager to jump into the question to hear their insights into this timely and important topic. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce today's panelists. First, we have Rupert Hammerman Chambers, who is president of the U.S. Taiwan Business Council, where he has worked to position the council as a leader in empowering American companies in Asia. Rupert is also managing director for Taiwan at Bower Group Asia, a strategic consultancy focused on designing winning strategies for the companies in Taiwan. And his areas of focus include Taiwan's political economy, as well as Indo-Pacific defense and security issues. Next, we have Dr. Xiaolu Shirley Lin, who is currently serving as Compton Visiting Professor in World Politics at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. Dr. Lin is the author of Taiwan's China Dilemma, Contested Identities and Multiple Interests in Taiwan's Cross-Strait Economic Policy, a book that highlights the divergence between the development of the economic and political relations across the Taiwan Strait through the interplay of national identity and economic interest, as well as implications for cross-strait relations. She also worked at Goldman Sachs, where she led the first round of institutional investment in Alibaba and semiconductor manufacturing international cooperation. Her research focuses on cross-strait relations, international and comparative political economy, as well as challenges facing the high-income societies in East Asia. Next, we have Stephen Eisel, Vice President for Global Innovation Policy at Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF, where his work focuses on science and technology policy, international competitiveness, trade, manufacturing, and services issues. Stephen has served at various private sector positions such as Peer Insights and NASDAQ. He's also a co-author of 2 books published in 2015 and 12 on global innovation. Last but not least, we have Alexa Lee, a senior manager of policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, ITIC, who analyzes the impact of cybersecurity, privacy, and innovation technologies to private sector. Ms. Lee is also non-resident fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center, where she focuses on technology and cyber policy. And I'm very looking forward to her insight about role of the TSMC today. So with that, I'd like to kick off today's discussion by asking each of our panelists to offer a few minutes of initial remarks on the topics of today's event, starting with Mr. Hammerman Chambers. Rupert, the floor is yours.
That's very sweet of you. Thank you very much indeed. Good morning to everybody. I certainly appreciate this opportunity from the Atlantic Council to talk with you all this morning about such an important and imperative issue. For those of us who've been doing US-Taiwan relations for a good number of years, we certainly can appreciate just how difficult a long-standing period it was to even be heard on Taiwan-related matters as it relates to US national interest. There was a long period there from the second term of the Bush administration through Mr. Obama's 2 terms where Taiwan should be seen but not heard, and a true appreciation of American national interest with the island and its commercial relationship, its geopolitical relations were clearly subservient to the broader interests of engaging China on a range of issues. And that, in my opinion, hurt American national interest. However, by 2017, we saw a significant shift. And while Mr. Trump was the custodian of that, I think it's fair to say that in the presidential election, the run-up to Mr. Trump's election then, it was clear that should Mrs. Clinton have been elected, with Kurt Campbell by her side on Asia-related issues, it was likely too that her administration would have had a far more hawkish attitude towards China policy, and as a subset, much more room or permission, as I like to say, for engagement with Taiwan. On the face of it, Taiwan obviously has a long history with the United States, but I think during the pandemic period, we've truly come to appreciate just how central Taiwan is economically to American national interest in the long term, as we've really started to grasp with what difficulties we've presented ourselves by going all in with the Chinese and what the supply chain has done vis-a-vis China. And obviously Taiwan has played a part in that, both positively and negatively, I might add. There's not really time enough to drill into that. It's a gray picture, not black and white. And I think also what we are seeing clearly from the moment that Mr. Trump took a phone call from President Tsai, congratulating him, all the way through to President Biden's comments just last week in the CNN town hall in Baltimore, Maryland, that we are continuing to move from a long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity to one of far more strategic clarity about American national interest as it relates to Taiwan and what America will and will not do in a clearer sense should the Chinese engage in any kind of kinetic action against Taiwan, or indeed, an increased uptick in gray zone activities, as we have seen through this calendar year, with increased activity in Taiwan's ADIZ and increased activities on the ocean, and of course, the never-ending coercive activities to block Taiwan's participation in international organizations, of which sovereignty is not a precondition. So as Mr. Blinken so concisely put, just in the last few days when talking about Taiwan's engagement with the United Nations, there is simply no reason why Taiwan cannot participate in many of these organizations. And indeed, it is in American national interest that they do, because we cooperate so significantly with Taiwan in so many critical areas for ourselves. Democracy, obviously this is about economics, but I certainly share the same view as I believe many of you would, that free markets, open trade and democracy are inexorably intertwined. And an open and democratic system which Taiwan has embraced under encouragement from the United States is inherently in our interest, because it continues to provide the appropriate platform to Taiwan to engage in economic liberalization and engagement as a critical partner, particularly in technology, where we as a country can feel as if when engaging Taiwan, that there is the necessary trust to handle American technology, whether it's through the foundry model, Taiwan Semiconductor. I'm sure we'll get into that a wee bit later on today, but generally the foundry model of which Taiwan is the founder, all the way through to Taiwan's development of its own technology processes, which I would certainly argue we need to keep out of China's orbit and open to and exercised by the free world. I would suggest to you all that we would be in even more significant problems if China were in charge of the bulk of the foundry semiconductor production in the world, and we were moving into the COVID period, and we were having supply chain access issues over chips. I can only imagine that the Chinese would certainly see that as an opportunity to extract political concessions in other areas. So I think we're really seeing why keeping this critical area and Taiwan outside of China's orbit quite quickly is of important interests to the United States. Just a couple of other quick thoughts. We've got a short amount of time and lots of speakers this morning. Taiwan's excellent Minister of Economic Affairs, Wang Meihua, some of you may know her well. She's lovely, super smart, very capable. Spoke at a conference just several days ago, and she did a fireside chat with the US Taiwan Business Council's chairman, Mike Splinter. Mike was formerly a senior executive at Intel, ran Applied Materials. He's presently our chairman of the NASDAQ, and he also sits on the board of Taiwan Semiconductor. And in that, Mike asked Meihua about Taiwan investment in China. And Meihua made an important point, which I'd like to leave you all with as I wrap up my opening comments. She pointed out that yes, Taiwan and China do an immense amount of trade together, but that dynamic evolved as a function of US and global pressure on the supply chain to produce at a low cost, high quality. And that pressure on the systems integrators and the contract manufacturers on Taiwan to move to China was a function of external pressure, not so much choice by Taiwan, but as a pressure within the supply chain. Now, I would suggest to you all that it's unlikely, even as the supply chain changes, that Taiwan's economic engagement with China will become less robust. But as policy changes in the United States, in the EU, in post-Brexit Britain, and other important trading partners, you're going to see further changes in the supply chain. And with Taiwan's critical supply chain partners, they're going to remain in China to serve the Chinese market. But what we are also going to see is continued expansion of Taiwan's supply chain footprint in Vietnam, in Malaysia, and in Indonesia, and in India. ASEAN will certainly be a primary focus, as will Eastern Europe and other areas. So keep a close eye on that. I think that's an important development for us. I'll stop there. Thanks so much for that opportunity.
Thank you, Rupert. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Lin.
Thank you, Dr. O. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's great to join you and to follow Rupert in this discussion. I know that Stephen and Alexa will be speaking specifically about critical supply chains to kick off the conversation and to discuss the dynamics of the global semiconductor industry as it presently stands. So I thought I'll make 5 points that we can discuss in further detail later about why we should be talking about this topic today. I think it's important to step back beyond the industry dynamic. First, I think including Taiwan in more multilateral agreements on trade and investment is much more important than ever before, echoing what Rupert said. Not only because it is important to support like-minded countries with common values that will make democracies around the world stronger, but also because it will advance the interest of advanced economies to seek a secure supply chain. Today, there's no greater alignment of long-term democratic values and immediate economic interests in terms of enhancing relationship with Taiwan. With China angling to join the CPTPP before Taiwan joins, which is a way of ensuring that China can then block Taiwan's entry into that regional trade group, the global economy is in jeopardy. As Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister of Australia, who saved the TPP from collapsing with Prime Minister Abe, and transforming it to CPTPP, he reminded me that the agreement was originally meant to strengthen, has always been, the members' ties, and it is important that China joins only if it seeks to enhance the values and make it work for China and the world, not just for China and its own state-owned enterprises. When Taiwan applies to join the CPTPP only 6 days after China did, China's foreign ministry came out in strong opposition already. The WTO model of both joining almost simultaneously will certainly not apply here. Second point about US leadership, where I sit here today in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's very clear that the US political environment makes it nearly impossible for Washington to rejoin the TPP, CPTPP in the near term. The fact that Washington is split between a national security discussion where upgrading relations with Taiwan is a priority and a separate economics discussion where there are reservations about working more closely with Taiwan's chip makers because of concerns about the China threat, Taiwan's regulatory capacity, Taiwanese companies' trustworthiness or reliability. Well, despite Taiwan's willingness to make the concessions necessary for an FTA by allowing the import of American beef and pork, there's been nearly no progress on reaching a US-Taiwan bilateral trade agreement, or not even begin that talk. Given the way that China is seeing everything as a security issue, and the US has reciprocated by securitizing a wide range of issues, from education to 5G, how can Washington be formulating a grand strategy for the Indo-Pacific region and for Taiwan without putting those kinds of discussions together? So today our discussion necessarily must be within the context of an integrated discussion. China today is investing more than ever in semiconductor, even if it cannot import machines for 14 nanometer or more advanced wafers process technology. It has the market to consume the chips and will eventually be able to supply most of its own chips, legacy chips, for use, for example, for electric vehicle. And if the US does not think about how to securitize all aspects of its policies, it will not be able to compete with China, which is subsidizing the chip industry heavily. In the long term, China has a winning hand, not just militarily. The US does not have its eyes on the ball and looks to short-term troubleshooting rather than developing a grand strategy to work with Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region to recruit talent, mobilize capital, create cutting-edge technology, and consolidate democratic institutions. Biden is very concerned about elevating Taiwan's international status, but many of the things are not nearly as important as enhancing economic relations with Taiwan. It is the best way to make Taiwan stronger and to keep the critical supply chain secure. This is as important as arms sales and effective and important immediately because it is a path for other allies and partners like Australia, Japan, or Europe, where Taiwan's Minister of Foreign Affairs is today, to begin negotiate their own bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. While Taiwan is benefiting from an unprecedented global shortage of chips and ICT equipment, over the long term, it has to seek to diversify and broaden its economic foundation, and it must be done in collaboration with the US and its allies. Third, I think for the US, trying to onshore the production of semiconductors, whether legacy or advanced, may be desirable but futile. The US has not been in fabrication for such a long time that the costs are now huge. Morris Chang said recently in 2 different opportunities that it is nearly impossible to imagine the US having a full chip supply chain onshore, even if it spent a massive amount of investment. And such a move may be financially undesirable in any case, and in the end, untenable, because part of the supply chain will probably be missing. I'm reminded of my long-time experience of founding SMIC in Shanghai, starting in 2000, and then serving as its chief strategic officer in 2009. Ever since I began to invest in China in the late 1990s on behalf of Goldman Sachs, I knew of Beijing's desire to establish its autonomy in technology, and especially in the semiconductor industry. Looking back, I think the US could be in the same situation. 20 years ago, China thought, and we all believed, that if China were to invest enough, and with the help of a lot of experienced people around the world, China would be able to achieve technology autonomy. But 20 years later, we are nowhere near close to that. So my experience is that to have advanced chip technology urgently is not something that you could spend a lot of capital and immediately see the onshoring success. And therefore, this should be a lesson that even if the supply chain is not complete, the cost is too high, this will all backfire. Efforts by nations to bring about chip production onshore, including the US, the EU wanting to localize production in a decade, and Japan and other countries, although they're all eager to onshore, the viability and the effectiveness is something that needs to be considered. And meanwhile, it is important to work with the existing companies like TSMC to achieve security in the supply chain. Fourth, for Taiwan, the China dilemma is both at its worst and its best. Taiwan has actually relied even more on trade and investment with China during the COVID pandemic. About a quarter of Taiwan's total trade is with China directly, including indirect trade, it's 40%. That is a historic high. A majority of Taiwan's cumulative investment is still in China. Compare this with trade with the US at 13% and a cumulative investment only at 14%. At the same time, Taiwan produces products in such high demand that it is finally having an opportunity to sell anywhere else, and it does not have to be restricted to China. So there is opportunity to diversify for the years to come. Taiwan's growth is phenomenal. Taiwan's economy is growing at 6.6% in third quarter, it's projected, defying this COVID-related weak consumption because of exports and investment. With resilient global demand, Taiwan has hit a new export record of $117 billion in that quarter. Beyond semiconductor, rebounds are seen in many sectors, materials, energy, transportation, with higher product prices globally. So the real reason for this, of course, is the fact that Taiwan is able to manage the pandemic and continue to produce despite it. The Asia-Pacific hub of the Reform for Resilience Commission, which I chair, just produced a report and convened a global meeting at the Miller Center here, where I sit, to show that vaccines are still in great shortage in Asia-Pacific, which will threaten the supply chain. Taiwan did not order enough vaccines like Australia and relied on the US, its allies and partners, and COVAX for donation, and with private sector companies like TSMC, who purchase vaccines for the Taiwanese people. It is threats like the pandemic that will really threaten Taiwan's critical role in the global supply chain. Last but not least, China is a military threat. Yes, it is. But I believe China's real intention and the long game is to bring about involuntary unification. This is entirely possible if Taiwan's structural challenges are not resolved and it needs help from the world. Internationalizing Taiwan in the long term is the best way to secure the supply chain. Taiwan has 5 P challenges, which I call are immediately demanding cooperation with the Indo-Pacific region. Population decline with the lowest fertility in the world, power generation as a high carbon emitter, and Taiwan has just come out with a detailed strategy to commit to zero emission in 2050, which has great economic opportunity. Political polarization, which is attributable to China's disinformation and military campaign. Parochialism, which is partly the result of Taiwan being marginalized by the international community under pressure from China, and the pandemic, which will be endemic, helping Taiwan become more international, exchanging experience in many problems of a high-income society, concluding a US-Taiwan trade agreement, cooperating in areas like energy, clean energy, helping Taiwan join multilateral forums, increasing Taiwan's participation in international organizations, as Rupert said, where its voices and experiences, where its voice and experience would be vital, are all important and essential if Taiwan is to improve its resilience in public health, national security, the economy, and the environment. Otherwise, Taiwan will have to move more closely with China because of its gravitational pull, and involuntary unification will become more likely. Thank you, Dr. O.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. So now I'd like to open to Stephen Ezel.
Well, thank you, Dr. O, and to the Atlantic Council for the invitation to be with you today and discuss this critical topic. The Indo-Pacific region today accounts for 62% of global GDP. The United States conducts $2 trillion in two-way trade annually with Indo-Pacific nations, with that trade supporting more than 3 million jobs in the United States and 5 million jobs in partner Indo-Pacific countries. More than that, the Indo-Pacific is not just a key destination for US exports, but it's also a critical supply of inputs, especially for semiconductors, for which Taiwan currently produces 92% of the world's most sophisticated sub-10 nanometer chips. In fact, as ITIF wrote in a new report we released just on Monday, titled The Evolution of Taiwan's Trade Linkages with the US and Global Economies, the United States has deeper inter-industry trade linkages with Taiwan than virtually any other East Asian trade partner, with Taiwan supplying more exports into US global value chain players than Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand combined, bound together by a belief in transparency, democracy, free markets, and the rule of law. Taiwan and the United States are natural economic partners. So in my view, really, the United States' first priority in this region must be pursuing greater market opening and trade liberalization through new trade agreements. We elected our leaders to lead, and so the United States needs to step up and join the CPTPP, and in so doing, bring South Korea and Taiwan along with it. That's especially important to provide a counterbalance to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, a 15-nation trade agreement throughout the Indo-Pacific region, which now represents the world's largest trading bloc and excludes the United States and Taiwan. Doing so would give assurance to US allies and trading partners in the region that the United States is fully committed to a robust economic policy that complements its role in security. Two other ideas related to trade are, one, the United States could expand work we've done with Japan to create the United States-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, which represents the most comprehensive and high standard agreement addressing digital trade barriers ever negotiated. We could expand that with more Asian partners. We could also look to expand the APEC cross-border privacy rules, which is a model for regional data governance that is now being used by 40 certified companies across 9 APEC economies. Existing CBPR members should open the framework to non-APEC members so it can become a global model. But most importantly, along with joining the CPTPP, is that the United States needs to pursue and complete a comprehensive free trade agreement with Taiwan, going beyond the current Trade and Investment Facilitation Agreement and the Economic Prosperity Partnership Dialogue. Those are important frameworks, but confirming a US-Taiwan FTA would produce economic benefits for both nations, showing it would lead to economic and employment growth in both countries. We must also work together to collaborate on supply chain diversification, as called for in the Biden administration's 100-day supply chain review. Here, the review called for President Biden to convene a global forum on supply chain resilience that would collectively access vulnerabilities and develop collective approaches to supply chain resilience. The US should do so and invite Taiwan in that conversation. Moreover, the review called for the US to leverage the $60 billion in available debt financing and equity investments through the International Development Finance Corporation to support supply chain resilience in key goods and technologies throughout the region. And here, one thing China does very well is to combine state aid and export credit to help their firms go into third-party markets to finance projects, high-speed rail in Indonesia, or 5G, smart cities, or smart grid implementations. In fact, from 2005 to 2019, Chinese long-term export credit financing was greater than 90% that of all G7 nations combined. So when we have programs like Taiwan's new southbound policy, or South Korea's new southern policy, or Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision, we need to bring these together more closely to counter China's One Belt, One Road and Digital Silk Road initiatives. So essentially, we should work with like-minded techno-democracies on collaborative international development aid, assistance, and development finance support, as well as export credit initiatives, so that we can help our competitors go into Indo-Pacific countries and have our vendors selected for infrastructure and digital technology projects. Two final points. One, it's been said that we need to promote Taiwanese participation in international forums. I just want to point out that the recently passed Senate legislation, the United States Innovation and Competitiveness Act, USICA, not only does it call importantly for $50 billion to stimulate America's semiconductor competitiveness, but Section 3213 of the Act, called Enhancing the United States-Taiwan Partnership, explicitly calls for the United States to recognize Taiwan formally as part of its Indo-Pacific strategy, and to advocate for making Taiwan a member of international organizations like the World Health Organization, Interpol, and the International Civil Aviation Organization. The United States also should advocate that Taiwan be graduated from an observer to a full member of the OECD. In conclusion, without a strategy for formal economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific, the United States could face less favorable terms of market access and influence in developing rules and principles and standards to guide growth of the economy and trade in the region. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Now we'd like to turn to Alexa Lee. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. O. My name is Alexa Lee, and I'm the Senior Manager of Global Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, ITI. ITI is the Global Industry Association for Technology based in Washington, D.C., representing 80 of the world's most innovative companies. We not only represent companies that directly involve in the semiconductor manufacturing supply chain, but also the downstream users of the technology. Semiconductors are foundational technology that are important not just for the tech sector, but all sectors, and Taiwan is essential in this supply chain. The global semiconductor ecosystem is complex and highly specialized that often involves multiple stakeholders in design, manufacturing, assembly, and testing. And TSMC alone dominates the manufacturing phase, capturing over half of the global foundry market. And today, only TSMC and Samsung have the capability to run cutting-edge 5 nanometers fabs. Next, I will share 2 points that how the US and allies in Asia can increase cooperation with Taiwan on semiconductor supply chain. First, Taiwan is crucial to US national security and economic competitiveness. For example, the recent semiconductor supply chain challenge across multiple industries has drawn increased attention to the need to incentivize semiconductor ecosystems in the United States. And semiconductors are one of the top priorities in the Biden administration's plan, and there are a series of legislative proposals on the Hill, including the CHIPS Act. And the momentum for supporting these investments has already accelerated with an example that TSMC is bringing a leading edge fab to Arizona. We have heard that other countries such as the EU is considering a similar EU CHIPS Act in Q2 next year. At this point, it is still uncertain and unclear how the US semiconductor ecosystem will mature, but one thing is certain, that for any countries who take technology innovation seriously, especially for AI and 5G, they need Taiwan closer to their supply chain. And second, Taiwan is also important to the US allies as a democracy representing free markets and a success story built on a market-driven approach. As countries in the world are calling for trusted ICT supply chain cooperation, we could expect to see like-minded nations forming stronger economic ties with the island, such as the US-Taiwan Semiconductor Supply Chain Forum and the increased semiconductor exchange between Taiwan and Japan. However, for any country who wants to become a global leader in semiconductors to attract Taiwanese expertise like TSMC, providing significant level of investment incentives and tax credits will be really important to compete with incentives offered by other competitors to offset the cost of building these capital-intensive fabs. After all, semiconductor leadership is not free. So for that, I will turn the floor back to Dr. O, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexa. And I really like to appreciate to all of our speakers because, I really wish that we have more time because we have so many great thought and I learned just so much from your insights and perspective. But given that we have, we have time restraint, so I like to actually have a question following up on Dr. Lin's point on the involuntary unification, China's long-term strategy. And you said that we should really come up with immediate plans for multilateral cooperation, with like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that is the key word that also that we heard from every speaker today. Then, so I'd like to ask a follow-up question to every panelist. So, Stephen, you also talk about this, like-minded techno-democracy, and Alexa, you also talk about trusted ITC cooperation, and so from Rupert too. So just taking a further step, so we hear so much about this value-driven alliance or some sort of multilateral framework, and we hear what we have nowadays with the Quad and AUKUS. So how do you think the current increasing trend of multilateral framework would fit into the effort that we like to enhance the resilience of economic partnership with Taiwan in Indo-Pacific? And would you recommend using existing framework, or would you recommend a new framework? And I know that, we all know that the Biden administration tend to focus on issue-specific approach when it comes to this issue. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts. And maybe starting with Shirley first, because that's what you, involuntary unification.
Yeah, I also see thank you, Dr. O. I also see a question from Mr. Tan in the audience that I think can combine with your question, which is how should we prioritize these efforts? I think it's one thing to write an article to propose something that will be good for the world. It's another to look at the reality. And the reality is I'm 2 hours away from DC, and it's very clear. It is impossible for Washington to be involved in some of these things, given the backlash and given the politics domestically. Every democratic country has its own political issues right now. Democracy is going through a huge challenge the last few years. And I think to think about multilateral framework is important, but as my speech highlight, I think it's very important for the US to step up and deal with a bilateral trade agreement, because that is the easiest thing for to get over an impasse and for other countries to think about it. And the audience question is a very good one. How should Taiwan think about trying to join RCEP, ASEAN FTA, and other kinds of multilateral organizations, which frankly speaking is impossible at this stage in the short term, given China's involvement. And I think we should be very mindful of it. The last few years, everyone has written about how important it is for Taiwan to do this, do that, how much the US should be helping. And really, the way to think about it is Taiwan has already done so much. President Tsai has given up, has paid huge political capital to allow pork and beef, pork, and there's a referendum coming up, but there's been absolutely no progress in discussions with USTR on surface. Of course, there's a lot of discussion separately. So I think that my highest recommendation is for the US to take leadership in pushing for a bilateral free trade agreement, with all of my panelists have also discussed. And then from there, we could seek to really enhance the Indo-Pacific region through other kinds of multilateral framework, which I think is going to be still under huge challenge, just like CPTPP, with China's dominance and importance to regional organizations like ASEAN. One last point is I think European Union has an opportunity because the people are so favorable. I don't think the governments are really interested, but Germany, for example, needs the chips. The auto industry is under huge pressure. And so this is a great chance for the value and national interests, economic interests, to really converge, to push for something. If there's ever a good time, I hope this is one opportunity.
Thank you. Rupert, would you like to share your thought?
Oh, just a couple of quick things. I would cite for our audience this morning, Mr. Biden's discussion with then Japanese Prime Minister Suga in May on semiconductor cooperation and the importance that Mr. Biden's government applies to international cooperation on chip-related R&D, broadening the manufacturing base more globally. what we've seen TSMC announcing production in Japan on top of its commitment in Phoenix, Arizona. I think there's a role for Taiwan here. The United States under Mr. Trump just at the tail end of his administration launched the Economic Prosperity Partnership Dialogue, EPPD. That will continue, as we have seen from the State Department and from Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Economic Affairs. There is an opportunity to push together EPPD and its focus on chips and what Mr. Biden and his government has started to talk to the Japanese about to make what is two separate bilateral engagements, one multilateral engagement, and you can have a, if you'll excuse the expression, a coalition of the willing. We've heard that before. Hopefully this one would be a bit more successful than the last one, and really move out on building a coalition of the willing on chips. I'd also like to just quickly touch on Mr. Kirk's question in the Q&A on CPTPP. Mr. Kirk, you know, I actually don't look at China's application for CPTPP through the prism of trying to stick it to Taiwan. I think actually what the Chinese are trying to do is stick it to the United States. In applying to CPTPP, in my view, what the Chinese are doing is highlighting the absence of a robust American trade policy in the region. And while China's application may have a low probability of success, let us certainly hope so, I'll say it, but I certainly think it does give them the moral high ground to say to the rest of the region, sure, we've got problems, but at least we're open for business. The Americans aren't. They don't even have a trade strategy. We are, we're here, we'd like to engage with you. And I think that was the primary thrust of China's application to CPTPP. Thanks.
Thank you. So now to Alexa and Stephen. So in addition to hearing your thought on this multilateral cooperation framework, so I'd like to also add one more question to both of you. So Alexa, you talk about the CHIPS Act in the report, you know, after the 100-day review of the critical supply chain of the Biden administration, you know, it highlighted Taiwan's you know, role in terms of the advanced chip you just talk about, but then also the report talks about Taiwan's subsidies enable its firms to outpace US firms and to play a dominant role in the production of advanced semiconductors in Washington, and also Washington's dependence on geographically concentrated foreign production for mature chips. So in your view, how can Washington balance its own domestic goals to diversify global semiconductor production, you talk about ecosystem, while also supporting Taiwan's leading global role in the global semiconductor industry?
Sure, great questions. And just given the fact that several Asian economies are important to the global ICT supply chains, I think there need to be, you know, a deeper discussion among US and Taiwan and allied countries about what does a trusted supply chain partners mean? I think there's a real opportunity that, you know, in these kind of bilateral, multilateral forums where they're talking about this issue, they need to kind of develop a more detailed, a set of more objective criteria about what does that mean and really get it into practice. For example, in the 5G space, they already have some kind of criteria around the Clean Network Initiative that Taiwan and some Asian countries are involved in that. So I think a similar approach could be taken, you know, in the supply chain front to model after the 5G efforts in this discussion. So that is an area I would definitely encourage them to look further. And another very important factor that often get overlooked in this discussion is technology workforce cooperation. And because just think about any successful advanced semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem, they really need a robust, highly trained and skilled workforce. And then without that, it's impossible to build anything, frankly. So then I think there's also an opportunity for US and Asian partners to increase STEM education and partnership with Taiwan. So these engineers, these talents, they can move across the region freely.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen.
So, it's been bad enough that the semiconductor shortage will result in 13 million fewer cars being made globally across 2021 and 2022 to a cost of $210 billion to the automobile industry. Now, consider a study which found that a hypothetical 1-year disruption of supply from semiconductors off the island of Taiwan, due either to natural disasters or to actions of other countries to deny production, would cost US original equipment manufacturers like consumer electronic firms alone $500 billion over a decade. We can see the critical importance of securing Taiwan's integration into US national security and economic frameworks, which in my view makes completing the FTA with Taiwan a priority. That said, I understand Dr. Lin's points. The political economy of trade right now is very bad in the United States. We need leaders going forward who are going to try and address that. A lot of the reason we have a problem with trade is because of China's unfair trade practices, which cost 4 million US manufacturing jobs over the past 2 decades, according to MIT economist David Otter. They practice a very aggressive brand of innovation mercantilism that is fundamentally at odds with their WTO commitments. We need to articulate new global trade narratives of countries that are going to play by the rules and produce welfare for US and citizens of those countries. Just to say about semiconductors. It's expected that demand for semiconductors globally over the coming decade will increase by 58%. That means we're going to need at least 60 new foundries around the world. So what I'm saying is that we can circle the square. We can produce much more semiconductors in the United States, build more plants here without compromising our partners in Taiwan, Japan, who also want to be competitive in this industry. So as you said, the US share of semiconductor fabrication, which stood at 37% in 1990, and by the way, 70% in 1970 is just 12% today. There's absolutely no reason why the United States shouldn't have a comprehensive strategy to increase that back up to this 25%.
Thank you. So I'd like to give a chance to Shirley and Rupert, if you'd like to comment on my second question on how to balance U.S. domestic goals with its international goal, just strengthening, just partnership with Taiwan on this issue. Shirley, would you like to?
Yes. I have mentioned it briefly in my remarks, but basically with my decades of experience in semiconductor, investing in semiconductor, and being really quite involved in China and in Taiwan, I think that it's very important to know that it takes quite a bit of time to move the entire supply chain, to onshore it. And so I think what's important is for the US to realize what its immediate goals are and its long-term goals. Is it to create jobs, to retain technological leadership, and to work with allies? I think in the short term, to work very closely with Taiwan is the only way to solve the immediate issue in this current cycle, which I think will be for many more years for the high end. For the legacy chips, it's a different issue. For the legacy chips, of course, we're going to have the cycle end probably quite quickly in terms of oversupply. As China is now overbuilding, everybody is now building, and most countries can only build more capacity in terms of legacy. So I think that if the US is focused on spending, the Senate thinking about spending $52 billion to get something in 5 years, they will be as disappointed to find, in 5 years, they'll have everything in Arizona. I think they'll be as disappointed as everybody has been in Beijing as to how China has invested in this, but did not actually get to where TSMC is today. So that's, I think, one thing is important to have the goals be clear and to meet those objectives so that the public see the results and the politicians don't face more backlash in the future in making promises that can't be met.
Thank you. Rupert, would you
I'd just like to comment on
Mm-hmm.
that right at the end point that Shirley made. I love the comments, and right at the end, promises that can't be met. I like that because I do think it's important to appreciate what we might reasonably achieve and where the cat's out of the bag. What might we reasonably achieve? We might reasonably achieve a reordering of the supply chain where, in respect to US national interest, we don't find ourselves 100% reliant on the Chinese for certain pharmaceuticals and other products where should this supply be cut, whether act of God or act of China, that the US would be caught in a very serious situation. We need to properly address those. And as much as we might want to take a traditional laissez-faire attitude towards economics and business, cost might have to take second place to geography and geostrategic interests. However, I do think that it's unreasonable and absolutely unlikely that the bricks and mortar that have already been poured in China in respect to the supply chain are going to be knocked down and moved somewhere. They're not. That the infrastructure, the supply chain infrastructure that we see in China at the moment, certainly from the Taiwan community writ large, is going to remain. And it's going to serve a purpose globally in a degree of production. That is simply not going to change. But we are going to see some shift in areas where we deem it important. And that brings me back to the chip space. And I do, we're seeing that with investment in Arizona. The Koreans are already in Austin, Texas, but an expansion of that footprint, and also how American national interest applies pressure on China. I'm really looking. I'm actually I'll loop back around with Stephen. He's prolific in what he produces, but I'm really looking for a good update on how effective US policy has been on pressuring Huawei in the 5G space. Where are our national interests in respect to infrastructure, and how effective has policy been in shutting that down for the Chinese? And where can we place pressure on the process, not just to bring us back into balance, but also to inhibit China's ability to dominate certain critical areas where we have, along with our global allies and partners, very real concerns about Chinese behavior and Chinese access to that technology.
Thank you so much. So we're short on time. So I believe, Stephen, would you like to just respond to Rupert? But actually, why don't I add one more question, if you don't mind? So Alexa, you talk about there's a need to have a deeper discussion, right? And in your earlier opening remarks, you talk about the importance of giving incentive and tax credit to corporations. And I think important key question to both of you is also how, and you also mentioned that how we should define trusted partner, and that also relates to what's the definition of the national security, meaning that because how to balance, how private sector corporations should balance their national security calculations with their commercial interests, right? So, I think we're in a totally different environment where companies are asked to join the meetings, at the NSC, White House, and the recent, request for information. So, what would be the position for the private sector companies and how they should respond to the changing sort of environment and this geopolitical issue set? And yeah, Alexa?
Maybe I'll just make a brief comment and then I'll have to drop. So I'm running my own event.
Oh, yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
But, just to point out that one thing the CHIPS Act does include is $750 million for the purposes of creating a multilateral semiconductor supply chain security package that would help the U.S. And its companies coordinate ICT security and semiconductor supply chain activities, including supporting development and adoption of secure and trusted telecommunications technologies, semiconductors, and other emerging technologies. And one manifestation of that is that TSMC is actually collaborating with Purdue University to now open a Center for Secured Microelectronic Systems, which aims to ensure a secure supply of semiconductor chips and all related tools, all the way from the foundry to the package system. So I think more programs like that, which are funded out of CHIPS, that are specifically designed to help our companies work together on secure microelectronic systems, with something policymakers should support. And thank you for the invitation to join today. I very much enjoyed the conversation and look forward to future dialogue with you all.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ezel. Thank you. And now, Alexa.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think as Biden administration is really making a lot of efforts around increasing domestic manufacturing, and there have been a lot of activities going on. And you mentioned the reason, the RFI that's looking on the risk in the semiconductor supply chain. And these efforts in overall, it's all great. They're all looking to it strengthened the supply chain here. But there is one compelling need, we really need to emphasize is there's no quick fix to the global semiconductor challenge because the pandemic itself has accelerated digitalization in a way that is unprecedented before. And the demand for chips is just extremely high across the industry. So there is no easy quick just to meet that global demand quickly, just practically, because just supply chain management practices are just very complex, and anything all requires long-term planning and active management, with a tons or hundreds of suppliers around the world. So things take time. So what really important is that's why we really need to focus on the long term. So that's why having the CHIPS Act funded, quickly as possible and pass a strengthened Fab Act that's currently going on the Hill that have a really strong investment tax credits provision is really important to solve this whole supply chain problem in the long term. Because as Biden mentioned before, there's no easy fix to this problem. And then, so the only thing we should focus on is making sure that we are making this investment strategically.
Maybe I could jump in, Dr. O. I think we should step back for a minute and echoing the other speakers, there's no long-term fix because this is a complicated industry that requires the basically collaboration of universities, academic institutions, educators. We're talking about all the way from talent to, when you're trying to boost the yield, to looking at really the process, manufacturing process, and to have the supply chain all the way so to fix it, to put it all together, including a lot of capital. Right now, what we're really doing in Washington is focusing on the capital side and some of it on the broader need to create the industry. But it's going to take a long time, and I'm not sure it's going to be successful. And so it's important to recognize that without the start of looking at the cost, there are a lot of calculations that it probably cost TSMC 5 times as much to produce in the United States compared to in Taiwan. And there's a lot of estimates on this. So we have to recognize if American companies are not coming back to onshore, how are we making Taiwanese companies come to the United States, put in all of this, take the incentives, and create this industry overnight? I think the short-term, medium-term fix, if you will, is to work with allies and partners and secure the critical supply chain in Taiwan and make sure that we move forward on that basis with a strong hand, as opposed to hoping that the industrial policy that the United States really did not have anymore, and we're competing with China that has an excellent set of comprehensive industrial policy that goes all the way from education to sending students to the United States to study, to work in TI, and to get the financing, all of that. And still, China cannot catch up. So I wonder what the U.S. prospects are, to be very honest, in terms of a long-term fix. And as we know, politics is quite short-term in this country right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lin. Like I said, I wish we have more time. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. But this is part of our continuous cross-strait seminar series. So we are coming back to discuss a lot of important set of issues, not just on U.S.-Taiwan relations, but the role of Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And like we said, we are going to come back with the next series on actually focusing more on security issues. And thank you. So I would also like to, just special thanks to our distinguished panelists today for sharing your insight. I learned so much, and thank you so much.